So for the puff sleeve sample, there are a few things you need. You need one piece of calico cut out using the sleeve template. And then we have a back bodice piece. So one piece again for that in calico. A front bodice piece. A cuff piece in calico. And one in interfacing as well. And you also need a bias cut strip that is 2.5 centimeters wide. So a few things to point out on the pattern template for the sleeve. We obviously have our grain line. We have our center notches, top of the sleeve head and the bottom, and we have notches to show where the gathering needs to occur. And that is also indicated by this line here. And also at the bottom, we will have gathering in our sleeve as well. We also have a slit there, which is on the back half of the sleeve. And we know it's the back because if we look at our notches, we have a double notch here. We have a single notch here for the sleeve. So make sure you cut your notches when you cut out your fabric. That's really important. It will help you greatly if you do it and you don't forget. It's really important for the construction of the sleeve sample. So our sleeve will be gathered at the top. At the bottom, it will have a banded cuff. It will have a slit with a finish, a bias trim finish, and it will also have a button and a buttonhole. And we're going to use the front and back pieces to insert the sleeve as well. So we'll do that. This is a set-in style sleeve, not a raglan sleeve. But the first thing we need to do is prep our slit and iron on our interfacing. Okay, so I'm at the iron. I've got it set to cotton. And I need to iron on my interfacing for my cuff. So with the wrong side of the fabric facing up. Now for you guys with your calico, it doesn't matter which side because they don't have obvious wrong and right side. But with the interfacing, the rough side goes down and the smooth kind of fluffy side faces up. And then you just place the iron, make sure it's on cotton, down, apply pressure. Don't move it because we don't want to move the glue. And then work your way out from the center. We don't want to move the iron like that because we could start to melt that glue in the interfacing and then stick it back to the fabric in like a wrinkled way. So we just apply pressure and we move from the center outwards. Okay, so I think that's stuck. Now I can do my bias piece. So we're going to use the bias maker. And the way we do that is we thread it through. Now we can use a pin here in this section here to feed through that material until it comes out. And it should be folding our material. I'm actually going to flip it this way because it's easier. Folding those two raw edges inwards. So all you need to do is pop your iron close to the mouth of the bias maker and then you gently move it along and iron. Just making sure it's folding it out nicely. I can see this has kind of gone off a teeny tiny bit. See one side's a little bit bigger. You just kind of have to adjust it as you go. And it usually sorts itself out. So this is what we're going to use to finish the edge of our slit. So once we've done that, we need to, I might just go over it just with the iron. We're going to fold that up and iron it so that the two new folded edges meet. Having steam on and water in the tank of the iron is really helpful to get a nice crisp ironed finish. So that's our trim made, ready to go. Okay, so for our little slit in our sleeve, now this is for the cuff opening. You can't really have a cuff with a button and buttonhole without having a slit in order to open it and close it. And our trim here is going to line the raw edge. So it will go, that will get opened and that will be inserted like that. But it is a little bit tricky because we're going over this point here, which means that the trim actually gets attached really close to that point, and then we continue around. But to begin with, I'm going to cut one end so I have a nice square end to begin with. So over at my machine, I'm going to, this is my sleeve here, I'm going to put it this side under and wrap my trim around that raw edge, and I want to stitch close to that fold. And to begin with, I'm just going to get my presser foot organised. I want to make sure when I'm stitching, it's stitching through all three layers. So we've got the top layer, the actual sleeve, and the bottom layer. And I want to be quite close to that edge. So I'm going to also pull my threads to begin with, a little reverse, and stitch along. So this is the tricky part, this part in here. So what you will need to do is open your trim, pull this so it looks like it's going to fit, so I'm pulling that quite tight, and then pop it in the point where those two will line up once they're in there, and then you're going to pull that tight. You will end up with a little tuck potentially, but we'll just have to wait and see. Sometimes we can't really help that. Then we're going to stitch that in place, keeping it nice and tight. Finishing with a little reverse stitch. Bring up your take-up lever, trim your threads, and have a look. Actually, that's not too bad at all. Alright, now we don't want it finished like that. We want that to be in the inside. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold our slit so we have the wrong side of the fabric showing, and we're going to create just a little V stitch line here, and that will make that sit a bit nicer. So if you imagine, use my little ruler here, stitching from that stitch line out in a V shape, that's what we're going to do. So then if you look on the inside, sorry, the outside, that looks a lot nicer. Okay, so now to move on, we can cut off that edge. And we can trim our threads. And that's our little slit there, that's finished. So we can now attach a cuff. But before we attach our cuff, we actually need to trim those threads as well. We need to finish the sleeve so it's a full piece. And what we're going to do is we're going to overlock these two raw edges separately, and then you're going to create that seam. Then you're going to iron them open. So I'll do that now and then show you what it should look like. Okay, so I've prepped my sleeve by joining my seam. First I overlocked the edges separately. I did my seam with 1 centimetre seam allowance, then I ironed it open. The other thing I did with my little slit there is I gave that an iron so that it is folded. Now here's my seam here, this is the back of my arm. It is folded towards the front of the sleeve. Now that will make sense when we put our cuff on. Now to do our cuff, we've got a few things we need to do. We need to do our gathering stitch. So if you remember, I had some notches in here which tell me where to gather. Okay, so I've got one here near my slit. Then I've got this one here which shows me that is the center point. And then I've got that one there as well. So that's one thing we need to do, and we also need to prep the cuff itself. So we're going to do those gathering stitches first. So don't forget, gathering stitch is straight stitch 0, but this should be on 4. Now when we do our gathering stitch, we actually have 2 gathering stitches. We have one at the sleeve head and we have one along the cuff. So I'll do the cuff one first. So find that first notch, making sure you have long threads at the back and you're not going to reverse. You can do a stitch. That is about 1/2 centimetre from the edge in between those 2 notches. Now I'm coming up to my 3rd notch. Don't forget the 2nd notch is the centre notch, and then you have that 3rd notch where you end. So leave your threads nice and long, and then you're going to do another stitch line of gathering stitch. This one's going to be a bit wider. If you see, it's about a foot's width from the first gathering stitch line. Alright, again, nice long threads. Cut that. And we can move on now with our cuff. Now this is our cuff. Now if you were doing a pattern fabric like I am here, I want to make sure my pattern's running in the same direction if it's a one-way pattern. Now in our cuff we had a fold line that was indicated on our pattern piece, but what we're going to do is we are going to do a couple things. We've got this notch here, if you can see here. So from there we need to do a square, like a tab. That's where our button's going to go, and on this end we're just going to do a centimetre down like that. And then we're going to fold it out and you'll see what's going to happen. I'm actually just going to, you can see there's a bit of excess interface. I'm just going to cut that off. Alright, so folded, and this way I'm just going to do 1 centimetre along that edge. Oh, better go back to the normal straight stitch though. And then on this other end, just want to check where a centimetre is. So about here, I'm going to do a centimetre on the short end. I'm doing it this way. This is going to create a tab, but I'm doing it this way because it gives me a square finish. So I've got my centimetre there. And then I need to do another centimetre along here, just to that notch. You can just see it there. I might just recut it. So again, a centimetre. I'm going to stop at that notch, do a reverse stitch. Okay, so now we have some of our cuff prep done. Let's trim these threads. What we want is we want these corners to turn out nice and square. This one's going to be a little bit different. But what I'm going to do is going to cut that corner off. And then turn this out. You've got that little tab that you've created. So it might take you a little while to get that to turn out properly, but just wiggle it out with a pair of scissors. And I'll come back and show you once I've got it turned out. Okay, so I've turned out my little tab section. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to fold in both sides of this 1 centimetre seam allowance. And I'm going to iron this. So I just have my little cuff. So I'm going to go to the iron and do that, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. Okay, so I've ironed my little cuff. I've ironed the 1 centimetre edge in. And how this is going to work is the little tab goes on the back side, so the back side of the sleeve, and that overlaps like that. It comes around and it ends up finishing like that. And then you have a buttonhole here and a button on that little tab underneath. But what we need to do now is to gather the sleeve to actually fit our cuff. So we can pin the first little part in there. So that sits right up. So this here should have a centimetre seam allowance, and that's got to sit right up into that tab there. And the seam allowance edge should line up with what's on the inside here. So it'll sit right up like that. And you can pop a pin in there. Now if you've ironed this well, you shouldn't have too many problems with things not lining up. I'm going to put my pin that way so it's easy when I sew it. So these edges should all line up. Now the other spot is the other side, or the front side of the little slit, which is going to be folded in, and that sits right into that edge. It's a little bit fiddly. Okay, get it right in there. So it's going to sit right up in there. It might be easy if I just open it. and then fold it back. Alright, and then I'm going to put a pin right on the edge because I need to access the ends of the gathering stitch. Alright, so we've got these ends here. And when you gather, you just grab the top two threads and then you pull your fabric along there. Now the other thing we need to match up is our center notch, which is here, with our center notch in here, which is here. So I'm going to pop that there and then close that up and put a pin through that. So now all I have to do is pull my threads. Actually, I think I've lined it up with the wrong notch. What I'm going to do first is just pin this bit in there because that part there actually isn't gathered. So from the little tab up to where the gathering stitch starts, that is all flat. Okay, so there doesn't need to be any gathering there. So now what I need to do is pull my threads to get all of this to fit in here. And if I look, I should have a notch. Roughly, must be that one. Actually, don't worry about the notches. I don't think I've done them properly. Alright, so we're going to pull these to get that, all this excess to fit in the cuff. So you can go from both ends, just grabbing the top threads. This is a bit fiddly. And pulling those gathers. Okay, so you can see that my gathers are now gathered more than my cuff. That's fine because I can loosen them off to fit. But I'm going to find the center point in between the gathering and my cuff, which is about here. Open that up, slip that in, and pin that in place. And then what I can do is just loosen off my gathers so that they fit in the cuff. Open the cuff, make sure you insert that sleeve. Now if you're doing this right, you should just see that top line of gathering stitch. Alright, now I can pin that in place. And do the same with that part there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch from here all the way along that edge. So to make it easy, I'm going to turn my sleeve inside out. And then I can use my threads because it's quite thick to pull my work at the back, get it going. Now remember to take your pins out as you go. Pull this nice and tight. Keep this nice and flat. And then stitch. Take your pins out. Might need to poke that back under. I'm going to pull it so it's nice and tight for the last little bit. Do a teeny tiny reverse stitch. Probably won't like it there because it's quite thick. Oops. Got lots of threads. Okay, so that is my little cuff with my slit, so that will end up being like that once we put our button and buttonhole, and it's got a gathered section as well. So what we need to do now is unpick that top gathering stitch and tidy that up. So I'll do that now, and then you'll have to look at the next video for the next part.